Good evening, welcome to the Tuesday, April 29th meeting of the Barrington.
Morning.
Roll call, members, please.
Back in here.
Yeah, present.
Happy Yellow here.
Alan present.
Connor MacGyver, Tom. Irvine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
You're up.
All right. So when we were here last time, a few weeks ago, we were talking about the zoning language. We said that when we came back, we would open it back up to if you had other thoughts or there were dialogue that you've all had. So before we talk about the subdivision potential changes, just wanted to start with that, John. See if anything.
Okay.
So the technical review group, I'd like to talk about how that interfaces process.
Okay.
And does that change at all?
It
Does
would
the
be the same
nature of
role.
those conversations
think
It would
change
be
at
the
all?
same role, that we would just, when a technical review group gets together, we're looking at the application and the regulations that we have, and we just go through it and do this complete, basically. Yeah, the issue from the other.
There shouldn't be any change.
Right,
That
it will be the same process.
Absolutely,
go through it,
yeah.
so.
So nature of the conversation doesn't change?
Share, John.
No.
Here.
You want to share? Oh, okay. You can share. Oh,
Did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
okay. Okay, I guess we can
All
proceed
right.
with the,
So you
Subdivision
should,
regs?
you should have a wonderfully tracked changes version of the subdivision regulations. And our thought was just to walk through and talk about it and take your questions and your ideas as we go. So I'll just kind of go section by section. So section 10.1, the authority and purpose. I think the biggest change here is because you have so much purpose language now in your zoning ordinance, that kind of talks about your intent with this ordinance and what you're trying to accomplish as a community. It doesn't seem like you need a lot of that again in the subdivision reg. What seemed important and what we got some feedback from Connor and Jamie on was to kind of clarify again the process, that there's this conceptual design process that's now required, and that you would like to see Conservation Commission involved early on, and then the planning board seeing applicant after they've gone. So we've just outlined that under 10.1, items 1 through 5. Thoughts or questions on that? Do you want us to explain that any further?
questions?
I have a quick question. I mean, before we had the conceptual review, we have design review, then we have formal application. So this four-step process is now taking the place of our design. That's what I'm hearing.
That's fair to say, because it's the conceptual meeting, pre-design, and then they're going to go through a process and come in with a better informed design is the hope. Submit their full application. They will have been through the four-step process. They will have already met with the Conservation Commission. They will have already met with you conceptually to do and to get their concepts.
All right, the conceptual review and design review were optional before. They choose the conservation subdivision process. The mandatory, is that what I'm hearing?
That's what's in the zoning, yeah.
All right, if we're gonna do that, the thing that I am concerned is not strong enough is the yield plan review. So, they always want to blow by that, because they've already done the thing, but it's the basis of everything.
Yep.
So, I mean, I want that clearly defined, like the first step, and maybe the conceptual review, whatever, but it's something we've always had trouble getting them to pay attention. And we've tried to strengthen it, and I don't think we've strengthened it in this iteration. I think it's an opportunity.
I don't think it's strengthened in the zoning you just adopted.
I don't think it's.
It was substantially. This is just the subdivision regulations now.
Yep.
This
Yep,
is basically
this
a
is just the
companion to your zoning.
Everything they've wiped out is
But
in
the
the
yield
zoning.
plan approval by us starts the subdivision process.
But now it's actually articulated in the zoning, so they really have to follow it.
But you know, I don't want that thrown in with some other meeting. I want it clear that that is a formal step that needs to be reviewed before anything else gets done. You know, we have to agree that this is the yield plan that you're starting from. This is the maximum number of, you know, properties you can subdivide to. Because it's always been, you know, as John likes to say, they take a grid, they just drop it down on the top of the plan, and it doesn't mean anything. It's meaningless. And
The point of this is to change that process to focus on the conservation. The yield plan should be, and always is, what it is, that is decided by zoning.
But
I apologize.
Yeah, you know,
Bob, that might pass it down.
What I was saying is,
this new process is supposed to focus on conservation, because it's a conservation subdivision, it's not a yield plan subdivision. So to focus on the conservation piece first, the looks of it.
No, I disagree with that, Jamie.
I know you do, but that's why we're trying to push, we're trying to explain
You gotta start
this.
the yield plan and say, this is the maximum number of properties you can get. That's where it starts, the basis, that's where it all starts. So that
No,
should
no,
be,
see, that's what we're trying to explain, that it doesn't. The yield plan is the yield plan that's determined by the planning board. But the point is to focus on the conservation piece, get the important pieces conserved, because they still, if they get 16 houses based on the yield plan at whatever point, it's where do you want those? What do you want to conserve? How do you want to manipulate the piece of property to conserve, to do the best to conserve land and the environment, and then place those lots within that conserved area?
how many lots, Jamie? That should be locked.
Ba-
It's locked in zoning. That's
Yeah.
what we've been trying to tell you. The
That-
zoning locked it in to what it is.
Every time if someone's coming in for a conservation subdivision, they don't pay any attention to the yield plan at all.
I disagree.
Yeah, I think what Ron is trying to say is they're giving us a very light survey plan that says, oh yeah, we've looked, we just did a conventional layout here. This is what it is, and this is what we can lay out, which gives them, which is how they get their lot yield for it. And what's happening is, and we've seen it in numerous properties where they're using either, they're counting in their yield plan fairly steep slopes, they're counting having to cross insane wetlands to do it. They're counting property that in all reality would never actually
The
happen.
zoning change fixed that, though. That's the point. Can you got a copy of the zoning with you?
Yeah, I have it open.
The yield plan language was altered and amended in the zoning ordinance. And we had this discussion 6 months ago, and went over the draft that you just adopted. So the yield plan language that you're speak to, Ron, is what we, just went through and you adopted in March. So I guess if you don't like the language that was just adopted, we need to amend that next year. But it was altered.
No, I'm talking about putting this in subdivision as part of the conservation subdivision process. Because
Well, that was what was amended.
first step is, if you're gonna come to us with a yield plan, it should be a yield plan we can actually approve. We would approve. We would review it and approve it. And so often we see yield plans come in that are no way approvable, they're no way financially feasible, they're just a joke. And unless we make it clear, that's a step that's gonna be reviewed and approved, they just continue to blow by it.
I know, I think, I don't want to frustrate you, but it's in section 632 in the brand new March adopted regulations
Of zoning.
of the zoning. So it's stronger than
You
ever.
even got to do test pits now in every one of them lots, which kind of serves no purpose when you got 60,000 of upland soils in each lot.
6 what?
6322.
Parens.
Yeah.
In order to arrive at this number, the applicant shall submit a conceptual yield plan showing how the parcel could be subdivided in a conventional manner. At a minimum, the conceptual yield plan shall include all topography required for the subdivision regs, along with location of all wetlands and floodplain areas. If the submitted plan relies on waivers to the subdivision regs, the applicant shall obtain support from the majority of the planning board that such waivers are supportable. The 4K areas, test pits are required on all estimated proposed lots. They're supposed to show steep slopes. conceptual lots shall adhere to all frontage requirements and demonstrate compliance with all road standards. The conceptual plan shall outline the location of all conceptual driveways. If necessary, the planning board may request additional information from the applicant to support the viability, realistic, and feasibility of the yield plan.
That was your language, Ron.
Probably was.
At least you're,
It's been a thing for me for a while.
you're consistent at least.
Yeah, it's been a thing, for a while since I've been
Sure,
before.
I get it.
I
Does
have
that make you
one,
feel better?
yeah,
I had one item under Article 10, 10.1, number
Yep.
6. I was wondering if language under zoning under 6.4, determine and permitted density. The permitted density of lots of a conservation subdivision shall not,
like that.
Oh.
Microphone.
Sorry, you said 10.1.6?
Is it 5 maybe?
right here, the front page.
Oh,
Number
you're
6.
you're
Looking
looking
at
in
the
the,
subdivision regulations, which is why we're here.
he's looking at the actual subdivision regulation, not the marked up subdivision
Ah, okay.
regulation.
All right, so on the second page of ours.
Oh, you don't have,
We submitted a marked up version for tonight.
It should be in
We
your
have it,
packet.
I have that too.
Yours would be,
But
10,
but it's showing as 5 in the marked up package.
No.
The same-
Right,
The same,
right.
the same wording.
I know, I had that copy here somewhere. All right, 5 or 6.
well, 5 or 6 are very different.
They're different, yeah.
Well,
10,
the marked up
6.
copy, 5
think
is
he means-
exactly the same as 6 in
Yeah.
the hard copy.
5 in the marked up, 6 in the non-marked up.
I don't know how many copies we have. In mine, it's the
5?
same language,
10,
with a 5 or 6.
10.1.5 in the marked up is the same as
Oh.
10.1.6 in the unmarked up.
But I don't have a 10.1.6
Yeah.
in the unmarked.
Oh, thanks.
In the marked
Yeah.
up. No, in the
No,
marked.
no, there isn't.
Oh, you
10,
said
That's what the
10.1.
problem is.
10.1.5
Right
is
here.
the same as
10.1.6.
We
10.1.6.
don't have
Okay.
the 6 here, and I read
So
mine.
which one, what came out?
I don't know.
It looks like 3 came out.
I brought it. I have it here, but
No,
I
you're
thought
right.
this one
You're right.
suited-
This is
Maybe
this
So
is
did
one,
3,
but it's the
sorry,
same
did
as
3
Yeah,
and
I
4
know.
get
I
combined
don't know why you're
into,
seeing it differently, but
in the original proposal into your modified version? What you wrote up?
10.1 and then 3 and 4 under that? are you
Yes, parents 3 and 4.
asking?
Give you some more.
We kind of just departed from all the struck out information that's listed that was 10.1, 3 and 4. This was
Okay.
reading it now.
Oh,
that's where
okay.
the confusion's coming. Thank you, James.
Oh, all right, thanks.
Just because when I look at the language, it is different between, in the original articles, parents 3 and 4 versus your parents 3 and 4.
So you're talking about like the within 60 days piece and at the next available meeting?
Yes.
Yeah, so we reworked that based on the meeting we had with you all last time and the fact that you now have this 4-step design process in there and you desire to interact with the Conservation Commission.
So for
Yeah,
clarity,
this
we'll all work, let's all work off the red line version, ditch the
Tell
other
us-
one.
and tell us where we got it wrong.
Yeah.
If there's anything we struck that you want to keep, we can totally do that.
In your mind, is this new version require them to meet with the Conservation Commission?
It does.
Number 2.
It's strongly recommended is the language. Yeah. I mean, if someone's choosing to do this, I would hope that they'd want to go through the steps to get that.
I got an idea. I was just gonna substitute what's in the. Yeah, okay, I'm looking at
Yeah.
number 5.
What is it, John?
I just thought the language was,
It's backwards.
Sure. Okay.
how about if we substitute 6.4 in zoning, which is the same thing, and have comparable, exact same language? That being the permitted density of lots for a conservation subdivision shall not exceed the density of lots permitted in a conventional subdivision within the proposed zoning district. 6.4 in zoning.
Okay, I'm happy to do that.
I like that.
Does that make more sense?
Because at number
Yeah.
5, the way it's written now,
Yeah, I
you
couldn't
can't
make
have less
sense.
lots
Yeah.
than what the yield plan is.
Yeah.
What it is, you can't have more lots in the yield plan. It's much.
Right. So I think, I know in past years, we tried to make language, if it's both in the subdivision regulations and in zoning, to make them the same. Just makes it easier. Okay, that's it for me.
Any other thoughts about other items that were removed, or do you want to go to 10.2?
I had a comment just about the introduction. I mean, we're trying, my sense is we're trying to get away from the term cluster subdivisions, and yet we have it in the introduction to the.
Yep.
That too. Clusters.
We can do that.
Charlie
Hold on to the
Foxtrot.
old language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does it say in zoning? Doesn't zoning say cluster still? Because you don't want to take it out on one and leave it in the other.
That's right.
I feel like we took a lot of that out when we went through this. We even talked about the grouping of lots, clustering of the lots.
Conservation.
That's the new one, yeah.
But I think here we missed it there where you pointed that out, Joyce. Yeah, it looks like in other places, cluster groups became grouping.
This references a conservation subdivision.
Yeah, I think we removed all the other clusters from the zoning. I think they're all. Okay.
So what do we want it to say there?
Just probably delete
Just
that
delete
phrase.
the
Just delete cluster and just have it referenced as a subdivision.
As a conservation subdivision.
Subdivision, yeah. Seems a little redundant. Maybe we can just remove it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just period at the end of the first conservation subdivision and eliminate, which is also referred to as.
Yep, that makes sense. Good.
Okay.
10.2, the design-related standards are now in Articles 6.2 and 6.3 of the zoning ordinance. So we removed half of 10.2. Any thoughts or questions about that? Just compliance regulations.
Could you repeat what you said? Sorry.
Yeah, the second half of 10.2 we pulled out. Because the design-related items are all in your news. Majority of them. And it talked about supplemental standards. Pulled a lot of those into the zoning so that the applicant would have to follow, choose to use that provision.
I mean, to be honest with you, communities that have conservation subdivisions or cluster ordinances typically don't have another set of documents in their subdivision regs covering the same topic. This is not,
For ease.
it's, everything's in one, it's usually in zoning. So this type of language, having a separate provision like this you don't see it that often, to be honest with you. I haven't seen it that often.
We're at least trying to strip it down and just add some flexibility or some clarifications where we can for you, but I think it can be much shorter, much easier. We don't want to lose anything you think's important, but I think as Mark said, we don't want to duplicate.
I mean, the zoning is rules anyway, and that's up here. Subdivision regs or regulations, they can be waived. There's a lot of detail in the zoning ordinance, and it doesn't, to repeat the same things or copy the same things and cover the same topics isn't really necessary. It's just
We've taken a different approach in the past sometimes. So the applicant does is bounce back and forth between sometimes. But the same, if he's going this way, we put the same stuff that's in zone, just so it doesn't go back and forth. So I hear what you're saying, but I think we've been stubborn on the board. We haven't always been.
well, if it's in zoning, they have to follow it. There's no, I mean, they have to follow the regulations, obviously, but zoning is more restrictive.
And it does prevent the bouncing back and forth. You just stay in zoning.
Well, if you're doing this, and the applicable things for zoning are in here, you don't have to go back over the zone. It's all here. So that's why we're thinking it's been in the past sometimes.
Well, pretty much the regulations 1 or 2 pages if we take all the drawings out too.
Yeah.
That'll be it.
Be pretty
They
short.
can just hold 2 sheets up. and it's a full regulation. That's
And then
it.
you don't want to, I think we talked about this last time, this is a fairly intense process for an applicant to go through, right? So we don't want to add any other. We want to
Yeah,
make it
and we're
easy.
pushing the 4-step process. That's
Right.
it. We don't want to get bogged down in something that was yesterday, right?
All right, so to that point, 10.3, application procedures, do we want to keep this language in here?
It's all on page 4 of the subdivision regulations.
Yep, so we can take it out.
I think we can.
That'd be great. How about road and utility construction standards? The one thought, and this was something that luckily Connor reminded us, we talked about with some of you back like 6 months ago, as Mark said. We had talked about the possibility of increasing road grade to maintain natural features as a possibility, and increasing road radius as it comes in, main road, maintain natural features. I didn't want to put it in zoning because there was a possibility if that were to happen.
I think we should keep that in our toolkit, unsaid. If people come in for a yield plan, we want to keep them at the 7%. Otherwise, they start going crazy.
Sure.
And we really stress that now, unlike the old days. Everything, driveway has to be 10%. All the roads have to be 7%. If they're going to build a bridge or a culvert, we want to know, is it going to cost $4 million? Well, too often, the last people who were here just dropped this thing on 500 feet and 600-foot elevations.
I take issue with that. I mean, as 2 previous planning board members and builders, you got a builder on the board, you got 5 lay people that often say it's unfeasible, and you've got builders that say, no, there's enough money out there right now that it is feasible. And I take issue that yield plans in the past ever yielded more density than that was applicable to zoning. I think that it's the opposite true now that the board's looking for details and more stuff to say no, as opposed to what are our zoning, what meets zoning, doesn't meet zoning, yes or no. You're not asking the yes or no, you're saying, what can we find that doesn't meet zoning that we can extrapolate from? So, it just personally, I take an issue, and I think from a board standpoint, and boards change over time and they can, but I don't think it's accurate that previous conservation subdivisions gave density that was not allowed by zoning.
I was just thinking that even you run into a situation where you can say, well, you can see, we got the slope here, and if we allow it to go to 9%, there'll be less trees have to come down. And everything.
Yes, and I think that's to my point exactly. Previously, there was those considerations, and I keep, from the beginning of this thing, I keep pressing the need for flexibility, because the whole idea of a conservation subdivision is to conserve. You're going to get the density, so conserve. And we've gone to the let's not do a conservation subdivision by finding these things and being so strict with the rules that we have no flexibility, and incorporating rules like, no, okay, that's the design of the road and we're not changing.
Well, I think the lesson we had learned with the yield plans, we've got to keep following back. That's the first step, right? The yield plan.
I think people describe a different lesson learned. Someone looks at a steep slope that was not described previously and say that steep slope never should have been built on, because I think that's too steep to develop.
Well, if you take a 25-foot slope and you
I want to take the zoning ordinance as it was written, and did they comply? Yes or no? We change zoning, it gets passed. That's the new zoning. Does it comply? Not, boy, that's pretty steep. How much is it going to cost? Give me some numbers and I'll decide if I approve it. I think that's the wrong approach to flexibility to conserve, the point of conserving. If it met your zoning, but you didn't like it and you wanted to see studies to increase cost, I mean, I think that's where we go awry from where this process is going to work. And we'll be right back in the same situation before, parsing out every little detail instead of trying to be flexible. You're going to get X amount of houses. How can we situate them in the best way for the environment and for looks now, as opposed to where can we find little details that we don't think work?
Are you really getting what's best for the environment? Because when I see somebody come in and strip cut a massive section of land.
Just
I
like
don't
a
think
young
they're
road,
doing
what
what's
they
best
did
for
to
the
Young Road.
environment. I think you're splitting hairs, Jamie, and that's our job as a board to sit here and talk about.
I think
Just
That's
real
not
quick
the
to rein
zoning
it in. Yeah, yeah.
administrator's role.
So just real quick to rein it in, I think to the component of the road grade and flexibility in the subdivision regulations, which is the purpose of the conversation, I don't think that language has to say that allowance for a steeper road grade applies to the yield plan.
Correct.
I think that language can say, once the yield plan is already done with the existing zoning in a traditional subdivision regulation, which doesn't allow that road grade,
Right.
the increased road grade, allows language that allows flexibility for the planning board to steer a developer and say, by the time you get to the actual conservation subdivision, we're willing to entertain up to a 9% road grade if you can demonstrate that in so doing, you're preserving natural features. And I think it's important that point be said and not unsaid,
Okay.
because the town is communicating to developers that this is what's important to us. And it speaks to Andy's point about strip cutting. So we can't prevent somebody from clearing a lot, right? We don't, property rights are strong. But if through the development process, we can steer a developer to end up with an end result that the planning board has defined as more appealing from what we've heard from residents and others in the community, this is an opportunity to do that. We've heard from developers that a steeper road or a shallower road grade allowance forces them through cuts and fills to clear the land, bring in just so they can meet the road grade requirements. So leave the yield plan part with the regulations that exist, which is 9%, right? Leave that alone. 7, excuse me. Leave that alone. Leave the 7% alone. They have to meet 7.
Does it delineate that in the zoning?
It's in your subdivision regs.
It's in the subdivision regulations, and I think the component that isn't in there now, but I think needs to be in there from when we met through the series of meetings, say in the conservation subdivision regulations under the road layout, add a note that says the planning board is ready and willing to entertain road grades up to 9%, given good cause shown for preservation of natural features, and the same extent for the road radius. You're steering the development. You're not forcing them. We decided we didn't want to just let it go to 9% for conservation subdivisions because that may not always be appropriate. But if they can come in and say, hey, listen, with this hillside and these trees, there's a bunch of, old growth oak in there that we'd like to keep, and it'd screen the development nicely, but we wouldn't be able to keep it if we had to do 7%. So we want to do 9. Or, hey, there's this rock outcropping here that to get around it, we've got to be a little bit of a steeper turn, a little bit of a steeper curve, shallower curve. I don't know the right word. But what's that? Gradient. But anyways, so I think leave it alone for the yield plan, subdivision regulation, conservation subdivision regulations, steer them and say, we'll entertain it. It's still at the discretion of the planning board.
Right.
So the planning board can still say, no, 7% is appropriate here.
The problem that we run into there is, and we've encountered this, I can't tell you how many times, is we get back here and they say, well, you allowed it over here, so what's your justification for not allowing it for us?
So what language, and I think this is where defining the for good cause shown, put more meat on that bone so that you are steering that and you can have a documented justification and put the ball in their court. Identify the components that is good cause for
We've done that in the past.
increasing, so that you can't have it thrown back at you. The challenge with doing this, that every application you get will have some component of, oh, well, we want to go steeper here. And it's the responsibility of this planning board to subjectively review those and identify if that's the intent of preserving the natural features or not. So the first couple of applications, you're going to be setting somewhat of a precedent for what you feel is appropriate or not. But the 4-step process in the meeting with the Conservation Commission will help advise that. The design review meeting will advise that also. But that is the downside. The downside is that it's subjective, and so you can, you have the controls.
But that's where we end up in a pickle, is because you have to write your justification for everything. If you're going to deny, you have to write a justification for it. On what basis are you denying?
But you're not denying, you're waiving the regulations. It's always a waiver still.
It's not a denial, it's a waiver.
But don't you feel that you should have, if someone says, I want 9, you say 7, why? 7.
Well,
Shouldn't
7's
you
the
have
regulation.
justification
Right,
to say,
seven is based off of what is acceptable for our fire trucks, our highway
No,
trucks.
7
our-
was for the bike path for Steve Diamond, plain and simple. We changed it to 7 for Steve Diamond for the bike path and pedestrian routes. That's the only reason why I got changed from 9 to 7. We can go back.
It may be helpful for the consultants to share in their experience across New Hampshire, road grade requirements. Where does 7% fall in your experience across the state of New Hampshire?
That from memory.
Only in Kansas.
I can, memory is that's, it's usually 8. I mean, we're in New Hampshire, there's not much flat. So it's typically 8, and I think, again, if they're asking for a waiver, if the board doesn't feel it meets the waiver, I don't think there's a justification for a lawsuit. I mean, we're not talking about denying a plan, we're talking about, allowing them, they're asking to go from 7 to 9 because instead of a 200-foot clear cut to build this road, because of the extensive grading that's going to be done, I can bring it down to 60. So the board looks at that and said, well, yeah, that's
what we're trying to.
over here, it's only 10 feet, and it's like, you know what, it's 10 feet. Do the same.
That's the point. You got your criteria for your waiver. If they meet the criteria, you grant the waiver. If they don't meet it, you say no. It isn't like you allowed it to
discretion
someone
thing.
else.
Exactly.
So it's going to be, you gave justification.
Hide it now.
You gave justification. The person that got the waiver gave good justification to receive a waiver. You haven't given good justification. It's not like we allowed someone else to do it for just any reason. And you look at your criteria for your waiver. I think there's 5 criteria or 4. I can't remember now. I got to go back and look. But you would have the 6. I know there's. So anyways, they would have to justify every one of them for you to grant the waiver. And if they don't, you just say, no, you didn't meet the waiver requirements.
And that's you saying, we don't see the justification for your waiver. It's not, no, make it 7 like it is now. It's, no, we see that you can make it 7 easily without cutting any trees, or no, you probably need 10 in this instance.
Right.
That's the flexibility that we keep talking about.
But even when we go through the waiver, you still have to justify your criteria and which element you believe they don't meet of the waiver requirement.
They got to support,
that's
they
your
got to
job.
support their justification, not you figuring a way to deny them.
No, but we have to support it as well. If they say, hey, we think we meet all of this, then we have to support it back saying, no, you don't meet it based on this criteria. We don't think you meet this specific criteria.
But the question is, to the extent that you're worried about the additional role of the planning board in deciding, an applicant could still come into you with every application asking for a waiver for the road grade. So this language doesn't change their availability to ask for a waiver. What it does is it would more clearly define the circumstances that you were open to that waiver being issued. And the narrow focus of these are the reasons that we would be interested in would be preservation of natural features and better screening. I don't know the exact language, but the point is to see if that's the appetite of the planning board to give them direction. They can ask for a waiver anyways. You can get put in that situation in every application that comes forward, but if you define in your regulations that in these circumstances we are open, more open than not to issuing a waiver. And I think the example of a 200-foot wide strip and build a road versus 60-foot wide. Is that the appetite of the planning board though, to give that? I'm seeing head nods.
And we can,
Make sure it's got it's.
So we need good language is what I'm
right,
hearing.
you need good language in here, and then, the waiver provisions is in another section of the regulation.
Yes.
And that's not part of what we're looking at, but we'll take a peek at that. It's only a paragraph, and if there's any language in there that looks like we could strengthen suggestions, we'll send that along.
That's great. Is in terms of the language, and this is going to have to be thrown back on you two to craft that, how we steer them, and it should tie to the criteria of the waiver so that,
Yes.
we know kind of where it falls. Preservation of natural features, better screening, I mean, that's what we talked about 6 months ago. That's pretty much it, right?
I mean, the language, 8.1.4 of the language, protecting of environmental and natural resources and accomplishing through the granting of the waiver, size, magnitude of project being evaluated, geographic location of property, site features, topography, a particular identifiable impediment exists or specific circumstance warrants the granting of a waiver. I mean, it's covered, the waiver will not in any, the standard language of the waiver will not be detrimental to public safety and health. But then it goes on to add those other features that I think, fit perfectly in that road grade. Topography, site features, geographic location, size and magnitude of the project, protection of environmental and natural resources.
Once again, if it's in the subdivision part, when we get to it, as long as it's not in the yield.
Yeah, this is language from subdivision.
The yield plan thing, there should be more discretion for the board. As long as that's.
I mean, a few years ago, in Hollis, it was a very controversial subdivision. Where right off the street, they had to make probably an 80-foot cut because it was all sand. And I was pushing or supporting the applicant's waiver to use some walls along the edge that would be on open space, not town, so the town wouldn't have to maintain them, to help reduce the width of the cut. The chairman was vehemently against it, and the rest of the board went around. So it got built, and so now there's this huge V that could have been 100 feet thinner. Would have looked better, and it's a case by case basis. And in that case, to me, having some walls that by now you wouldn't be able to see because the vegetation grown up and it would have been invisible. Initially, everything doesn't look that great right at the beginning, but over time, stuff disappears. It would have been, 100 feet less of trees being removed, and it makes a big difference. So.
We go to the next section, which is the drawings, diagrams. So when we looked at this with you all a while ago, we realized that there were some really good things about these diagrams. For one, you had the 4-cluster design, and that seemed to be what people were railing against, that you had some that kind of looked like that. So these really helped kind of inform the work that I think you did that led to your zoning changes. We're wondering if you need all of them. We're happy to create an updated diagram or diagrams if they work for you, if they actually help the board and the applicant. It seemed like figure 1, the sample comparison of conventional versus cluster, you probably don't need that unless you feel otherwise. Okay. Yeah. So then on figures 2A through 2D, we put in the comment section a few things. You have quite a few options, actually. You could look at laying out for people the 4-step design process. The challenge with that is every site's different, so you don't want them to think it has to be exactly like we showed you on those slides last time. One thought we had was we can create a good drawing as an example that shows the grouping, that shows the distance between grouped parcels, that shows the frontage requirement buffering, that shows to really show the standards you have in zoning, what that looks like, what these terms are, the distances. Would that be beneficial? Do you have other thoughts about what would be helpful?
I think that'd be almost required.
Okay, we can do that.
An example that shows what we're looking for.
Okay.
I agree, and having a drawing, I think, will be really for people to understand.
Because we now have limited number of, we have defined clusters we're allowing. It's a 3, I forget. We have new space in between those groups.
Exactly.
It's different than it's ever been.
Right.
Yep.
So I think we need a drawing that shows that.
Yep.
We can do that. So Liz from our team is prepared to do it. She's waiting to hear back from us tomorrow. So she'll get on it pretty quickly. So when we get you the new draft, we'll have an example you can look at. And then if you think there are things you want changed or additional things you want pointed out, we can make those changes. So.
We don't know how this is going to play out. We're going to have a road going through 200 feet of buffer. Maybe at an angle so you don't see the houses. It makes the turn.
Right.
Already you're probably approaching the 1,000-foot limit, so we'd have to give a waiver to go beyond that in the circle. Are they going to put 4 houses, 100-foot buffer, 4 houses on the road, across the street, 4 houses, 100-foot buffer? Is that how it's going to end up? Rather than these little pods that really look so nice, drawings,
If you do that, you'll have a 2,000-foot dead-end road.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's gonna depend on the site too, right?
Depends upon the site, yeah, the topography, all these things depend upon the ideal.
Does not exist.
Yeah, well, we'll find out once we go through this, how things play out.
All right, so the next section is a meaty one, and our strategy is to basically get rid of most of it. So there's a section 10.6, ownership and maintenance of common facilities and open space. Do you want to share what your thoughts were?
I when I look at this, this just seems to go on and on and on. Looking at different provisions or possibilities of open space and how it's managed. And it just seems that it could be consolidated and really boiled down to some pretty small paragraphs.
Yeah, we provided them.
Oh, there they are.
Yeah.
On page 8, there's a couple of sample language from Hollis and Greenland that really address, and I've been working in Hollis for almost 20 years now, and we've never had any issues with open space as far as how it's managed. And it's a simple paragraph that's there. Not overly complicated. I'd say almost 100% of the time, the open space stays with the homeowners. There is an option to go for public, but most developers just want to keep it. So we're just trying to simplify again. If you're comfortable with this language, if you like it, then obviously you can keep it, but it just seems that it just repeats itself quite a bit and goes into a lot of detail that, I don't know, we don't find necessary.
There are a couple, before you weigh in on it, there are a couple of thoughts we had, and we checked in with Connor and Jamie on this too. So you could call out a preferred transfer of the land to the town. You could make that really clear that that's what you like, and that's what seems to be happening here. Connor can make his pitch for this. You could also mention a one-time monitoring fee that if the land's transferred to the town, that's something that can happen. I think we talked a little bit back and forth about that. It just adds another thing. But Connor, can you make a compelling reason why we should have?
I don't necessarily think there is I don't think there has to be, I don't think that has to be a component. But one of the things we talked about 6 months ago was those components of the open space that we wanted to have as a requirement in the subdivision regulations, under the understanding that the conservation subdivision regulations are optional. And so we aren't forcing a developer to do anything in terms of access to the open space or anything else, that this is an option, and what is set in the subdivision regulations is a condition of that option. And obviously a condition that can be waived, and that's why it's in the subdivision regulations. Some of the things that we talked about were requiring public access on the open space, regardless of who owns it, right? Regardless of if they transfer it to the town or they keep it at the homeowners association or whatever else, but requiring public access. Requiring the development of trails or the connection of trails on that open space as part of the development. So it isn't just that there is open space that's available for access to the public, but that trails are developed. Right now we end up with, a 50-foot swath of land and access for people to get, and trails aren't always developed. The Trails Committee has been working for a couple of years to figure out the best way to develop trails out back here. They're going to get started pretty soon, cutting some trails in, but the development of trails was one of the things. One of the things we talked about, which we decided against at the time, was parking, with the idea that if we can get enough trail and trail interconnectivity, we don't necessarily need parking areas in every subdivision that allow anybody to come and park and use those trails. So let's build out trail interconnectivity so people can funnel in from everywhere across town and access trails or a subset of trails, et cetera. Some of the other components that we talked about in the Conservation Commission, it may be interesting if any of the members of the Conservation Commission that are here are interested in speaking to it, they can, but this may be an ongoing conversation with the Conservation Subdivision, are about things like the monitoring fees. So having consideration for, if the land is transferred to the town, a one-time payment for a monitoring fee becoming part of the regulations, a requirement in the regulations. So, the Conservation Commission is funded through land use change tax. So most developed land that's coming out of current use, 75% of those land use change tax penalties are going to the Conservation Fund, regardless of who owns the open space. But the idea when the town takes ownership of open space, the town has to monitor that open space in perpetuity. And so one-time payment, I think out back here is like $10,000. Made a one-time payment, hey, in recognition of the work that you're doing. Doug Bogan, chair of the Conservation Commission, recently brought up the idea of a, what's the term? The term for a conservation property where they do like an existing conditions, they do a whole survey of the existing conditions. They call it a baseline study assessment thing. Okay, so there's value in whoever is responsible for open space in having a baseline study done to have that as the baseline of the property. And he also mentioned environmental assessment, although environmental assessments are almost always done if there's financing involved with the developer or anybody they're selling lots to. They want to see that at least a phase 1A environmental assessment was done on the property.
The only reason you'd really do something like that is you're concerned about contamination.
Well, they do the environmental. They do. I mean, that happens on all the projects anyway. So I don't necessarily think there's institutional value in requiring it. You may hear from the Conservation Commission, although that they're just kind of getting to that point now. But you may hear that with the acceptance of town open space that the town would own, that maybe either monitoring fee or a baseline assessment.
Connor,
Yeah, please go ahead. Sure.
Phase 1 and a phase 1A is purely a desktop study.
Mm-hmm.
There is no actual physical on-site that's done with it unless something is identified through the document review to create cause or justification for a reason to go do a 1B. Yep. Otherwise, you wouldn't do that. It's purely a desktop study.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. The phase 1A, that's what all of these projects, they do them anyways. So I don't think we would need to require them otherwise. So we're talking about the subdivision regulations and what you may want to include relative to open space. I will also say that separate than the subdivision regulations, the select board, typically is advised by the Conservation Commission, still is the gatekeeper for any land that the town accepts. And a perfect example is the old Gupto pit, right? So when the developer approached the town and said, we want the open space to be held by the town, separate than the subdivision process through the planning board, hired the town's engineer to go out and do an evaluation of the property and say, hey, what might we need to pay attention to with this pit that isn't just raw land, which is typically what it is. And he said, hey, look, there are some slopes out there that are steeper than the natural angle of repose. And so those should be cut back. The ones that aren't vegetated, those should be cut back to whatever the slope was. There's a lot of invasive species out there because there's been truck traffic in and out, and those invasive species should be remediated. There's a lot of open sand, and the loam should be spread and it should be seeded so it can start to, revegetate. And so the select board, through its authority in accepting that land, made those conditions of the acceptance of the land. And so there's still an opportunity for the select board to require site-specific items on a piece of property before accepting it. But if there's something the planning board, if there are components the planning board wants to require for every open space, whether the town accepts it or not, here's the place to do it. If the planning board, for its purpose, recognizes the value of the town owning the open space, now's a way to call that out. It's always an option, but call it out as an option and keep the language simple. So, yeah, I know you asked me to talk about monitoring fee. I mean, I think monitoring fee it's a component you can build as part of that, but I don't think it's the most important part.
Does the monitoring fee go into a specific account?
No.
So that would be something I think should actually be a requirement of it, is that the monitoring fee goes into account that is dedicated for the purpose of monitoring, because otherwise the concern is that it ends up in the Conservation Fund's general fund, and then it just gets spent wildly with everything else that is wanted to be spent on. It does not get allocated for what the intended purpose of that monitoring.
Here's the problem, though. I mean, I hear what you're saying, but they have to monitor it in perpetuity anyways.
Right.
So
It's
it
just a
doesn't
line
matter
item.
whether they're, and it's an accounting exercise for $10,000. We'd spend more money tracking it in a separate account for 50 years than the $10,000 that's in the account.
We're saying it all moves into one account. So every time you do one of these and somebody says, I want to pay the one-time fee, that one-time fee moves to the monitoring account. Because there will come a day, and it may be long past I'm here and you're here, but there will not be conserved land coming out to pay
Current use land, yeah.
current use land to pay these fees. And the Conservation Commission is somehow going to have to be funded to do it. Or you may have a year where you have very little money that come with properties coming out of current use.
So, I mean, I think the monitoring fee is just one small component. I don't know how the planning board feels. I mean, we can start there because that's where it started and that's where we are now. I mean, do planning board members have a strong opinion about whether or not you want to include as a requirement in your subdivision regulations that if the town ends up with owning the land, that a monitoring fee is required? Do you want to ask the Conservation Commission to weigh in, not necessarily now, but at a meeting? Have you talked about it at a meeting? Okay, do you want to speak to it? Okay. Yeah. Grab the microphone, from the consultants. You can stand at the podium. Paul Panish, or you can sit there. Yeah, fine.
Commissioner, 101 Ross Road. So, yeah, we have talked about monitoring fees, and the concern is that current use lands are vanishing. They are the means by which the Conservation Commission supports itself, and we're expecting that those will go away. We're also hoping that at some point the town will have someone who is dedicated to the Conservation Commission on the staff who would be able to do these monitoring activities because they're very burdensome for us and we're getting overwhelmed. So we do feel that a fee is necessary. I didn't realize that there was going to be a one-time fee. I thought that it would be an annual fee that would be paid for the purpose of monitoring. Andy, I'm not quite sure what you were suggesting about a separate fund. I mean, this is the means that we're thinking will contribute in the future. It won't be the only means, but it will be a contribution to how the Conservation Commission supports itself.
I'm just looking to ensure that it is a dedicated line item in the budget so that the money can't be spent in another fashion. It is committed for the purpose of monitoring.
But we don't see it as being only for the purpose of monitoring. We do see it as a support mechanism for the Conservation Commission in its function of acquiring lands for conservation and maintenance purposes, kiosks, signs, things like that. So we do see it as being more general than that.
I guess that's my concern is what happens is
You can't call it monitoring.
you can't call it a monitoring fee and then go use it to buy more land. Like that's.
Could you round it out and say a one-time fee for monitoring, trail maintenance, and just kind of list out the things that
If that's the appetite of the planning board, right? I mean, we don't know until applications in the new era of conservation subdivisions start coming in exactly how the scales will be balanced. But I think we have an appropriate sensitivity to keeping the scales appropriately balanced for developers to continue pursuing the conservation subdivision regulations. And so I think we do need to be careful about, in the first instance, tipping the scales too far in disincentivizing a developer to choose the conservation subdivision regulations. And so.
I think these regulations in a way is going to unincentivize it quite a bit because we used to put a whole bunch of stuff out there to try to get them to do it. So now you start doing the cluster groups like John was talking about before. Their main thing they were saving on was they could build less roads. So now if you got to keep doing these little pods, they're not building less roads. Then you got to put into a monitoring fee. And then you got to go through this whole process to get started, which is going to take months longer and a whole bunch of extra studies. You got to do test pits on lots that you're never going to build on. You're going to get to the point where these guys are going to say, I'm just going to do a regular subdivision. There's no gain for me. It's all a total loss. Now, the advantage is if you can keep them to use the conservation subdivision is that those lots are smaller. The open space stays that way for perpetuity. What happens is with these larger lots, especially if the state keeps doing the stuff they're doing, that's going to be re-subdivided and re-broke up. So the thing is, that 20 lot subdivision would stay 20 lots. If it's a conservation subdivision, it could be 40 or 50 lots in the future if you did a conventional subdivision and you built the whole thing out. And I think a lot of these rule changes are actually disincentivizing it right now. I think it's at the tipping point now where guys might say, I'm just not going to use your conservation subdivision because of the new proposals you've had this year. That's my personal opinion.
Well, we'll see how it works for a year, and we can always change it. I mean, if-
And the components that are in zoning, right, those aren't going to change for a
Right.
year. But the parts that are in subdivision regulations is the part that we're talking about right now. And so straw poll on monitoring fee is as part of the requirements that would be adopted in updated subdivision regulations now.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I don't have a problem with monitoring fee per se, but I hear Andy's concern, which is gonna be, there's not a lot of support for development in the town, let's face it, so the blowback is gonna be, I think, well, you took the money from monitoring, used it to buy more land, and now you're asking for an FTE, full-time employee to do the land, so you're gonna get, you open yourself up to pushback on this, I think. If you take that money that was for monitoring properties that we now have, use it to buy new properties that require a full-time employee to monitor, I mean, this
So what I'm hearing
how
is
it's not gonna-
maybe the
it's not gonna
planning
flow well
board,
with the taxpayers.
maybe the planning board wants a more comprehensive, long-term plan from the Conservation Commission. There's still a lot of land in current uses that's coming out. I mean, we're not at the doorstep of the conservation fund.
45% of the town is in current use.
And not to mention that the Conservation Commission has something like $700,000, 600 of that, which may be unencumbered. And so our backs aren't up against the wall. So maybe we want the Conservation Commission to do some long-term planning and figure out how a financial component of accepting conservation land may be of value for the planning board.
No, recently,
Yes.
there's this discussion with Oak Hill, for example. It kind of evolved that the town would take the property. They
Yes.
saw it one advantage, no liability if anything happens, the town would assume that. If we could have a fee that actually accomplished things, because we want to put trails on there. There's a lot of wetlands. We should probably have somebody, a wetland scientist, be hired to determine the quality of that. So rather than just call it a monitoring fee, if we could broaden that fee into something that includes those things.
Call it a maintenance fee.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll have the Conservation Commission workshop that,
Yeah.
and we'll revisit that in the future.
And we can revisit that, and these issues can be raised when we come.
And to speak to Ron's concern, I hope you weigh the benefit that you talk about buying more conservation land. So the anti-development people, when they see a 600-acre piece go into conservation or a 20-acre piece, that's never going to be developed. So that ergo meets the requirements and satisfies those people who don't want to see another house on that big piece that get developed. So it's, kind of a self-licking ice cream cone here, but when that money goes to them and they buy another, 200 acres, that's never going to be a house there. So that's the benefit, to the trade-off of, I understand what Andy's saying, and I like the idea of, the separate fund to make, because you go buy the land and there's no money left to monitor.
It's just a line
But
item, and it's
the
just a
benefit
line
of buying
item.
that piece of land and there's never another house there and another piece of conserved, it satisfies those residents that are concerned with that. So you get two benefits there.
I think the residents right now, rather than see a conservation subdivision, rather see no development at all.
So we'll stay on track. We'll stay on track for where we are.
Making it
That's
easier
the
to do any
Conservation
development.
Commission buying it.
We're all here because we don't have a one-track mind, right? We're all here because we're finding that balance. So for the conservation subdivision regulations requirements, do we want to include a requirement that the open space is open to the public?
Yes.
Yes, and this language makes it look like that you propose, makes it look like it's kind of a secondary option. So I
Strengthen it.
yeah.
Yep.
Just to kind of
Bring that to the top.
In the first instance, required that it's open for public access. For trails, so there are a couple of things we talked about with trails. Where there's an opportunity to connect to existing trails, that seems to be priority number one. If there is a trail nearby, we want it connected. Yes?
Yep.
And we want them to develop that connection, from their development to that connection. I'm interested in your opinion. I don't think we need to dictate a lot on how they develop that connection. like start developing trail standards in your regulations that, but I think they got to make the connection.
If they
It's
make
a
the
trail.
trail, the Conservation Commission can
Yeah.
approve it.
And maybe that's something they consult the Conservation Commission on.
I'd suggest they work with the Trails Committee on that.
Of course.
We do have a committee for.
Yeah. So in cooperation, and that can be in the language. If there are no connection points, so now we're kind of like working down the priority list, do we still want to require them to develop some trail on the open space that's available to the public?
I would, my take on that is it would really depend on the size of how much is being conserved. Like, and I'll use, for example, like you think of a large piece out on the far end of town that could be developed, that would be a pretty sizable conservation piece. So there, maybe you want it to, and it might not connect to anything else. It may just
Yet.
loop through that, right?
Yep.
Because there's nothing else for it to connect to at this point.
In something that might be more digestible for developers is if you put it on the front end for the yield plan to lay out things, like you're talking about the wetland delineation. If you put that in the yield plan part to delineate those things for future trails, that map may be done. The other thing that I feel is important that I would like to see is the borders delineated. And this one came up on Young Road, most recently, is if we put in there the delineating conservation borders before they start excavation, they know the parameters of where they're working. Because the first call I got was when they cut a tree on Young Road. They can't cut in that first 100 feet. If it would save the Conservation Commission from doing it, and they would know the boundaries to which they have to work. So it's front end loaded that it doesn't feel as bad to them, and it takes burden off the conservation to go out and post all those borders, and it shows them where to work, and so we get less infractions in the area you don't want them working.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If
So
you're
we'll-
selling $1 million houses, you get $10,000 for a forester to go out.
Right.
Gotta
and
survey
mark
that line
things.
anyway.
Yeah,
Right.
and that
And
these
flag
people out
it so the
here,
guys that are cutting.
they're gonna cut a tree this year and a tree next year. Next thing you know, you're 40 feet into the conservation area. You don't know what the boundary is. You don't really care. It's my land, and eventually your backyard spreads. So by putting those border signs up early and at their expense, I think it's easier for them to digest. It's just another step.
So let's stay on trails real quick, and then we'll go to blazing. So trails, for the sake of trails, I'm hearing language that says if it's appropriate, where appropriate, develop trails. But most of the time it will be appropriate.
I don't think so. We've had a lot of smaller ones that I think there's no nearby trails and,
It's just for nature.
Well, I think it's a case-by-case basis, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
you'll know when you see it.
bigger or existing trails adjacent to the property or,
May be required.
yeah.
Maybe
Part of the
required.
problem, we also have 3,000 acres in Congress with the recreational discount. I wonder if the Trails Committee is looking to, they're getting a discount.
There's not much of a discount.
I know there
T-
isn't.
10
We're only
10
paying $78
20%
for-
discount on 1% of actual values doesn't really change a whole lot. Okay,
But they're taking it.
they are taking it. Okay, so the blazing of the open space. There seemed to be there's a lot of support for that. How do you expect that to be done? Like flagging tape, or like blazing on the trees? Jamie said signs.
They've got
They got
signs.
plaques.
I can go get one.
So those circular signs tacked on trees
That's
and
actually
posts.
very common
Yep.
to require up front. That way,
So language for that.
it helps the cutter, who can get,
Awesome.
Turned around.
excited
Turned around.
We're
Prior to-
at that 4-foot wide old tree that's sitting there. But it's also good for the creep, which we've seen when the homeowner moves in. It's like, my lawn's just getting a little
so prior to site work,
bigger every year.
blaze with awesome. What else? Is there anything else at this instance? Like we said, we took parking areas. We took parking areas off the list. We're still happy with that decision.
Why are we taking them off the list?
The conversation was we don't necessarily want to create a bunch of parking areas all around town in neighborhoods that allow or invite people from anywhere, Barrington or elsewhere, to come and park and use those trails. Our priorities and goals with the Trail Interconnectivity Stakeholder Group, which we've been meeting for about a year now, has been to develop trail interconnectivity so everybody kind of all throughout town has trails close by that they can get to, and they can funnel out and eventually hopefully get places to. But to focus on some core parking areas like in the town center, like the Winnie the Pooh Trail and some of the other larger conservation properties, but focus our parking area energy on those primary points and not create a bunch of small parking areas all over that eventually will have to be maintained by the town.
And monitored by police, it becomes an
Yeah.
issue when you got little people parking everywhere, doing things in little tucked away spots.
Yep.
I mean, typically, I find like the neighborhoods are pretty keen on, self-policing on that, because you don't want to riffraff running around your neighborhood.
And they park in that parking thing, they're out hiding behind your house.
Yeah.
But we'll need a process for how to determine when there should be a parking space there. And it, maybe the trail isn't yet there, but how are we gonna, like, just preserve the right to?
Well, in Young Road, we got one there because it connects to the Winnie the Pooh thing, the whole Goodwill thing, so.
That's a sizable piece back through.
Yeah.
So maybe,
I think that, I don't think we want to eliminate it, because I think the Young Road is a good example where it was a good idea.
Yeah, but we're not eliminating it. Oh, we're eliminating the
I was
requirement.
just saying eliminating the requirement.
it's not a requirement now.
Requirement now, it's an ask.
But are we when deemed appropriate?
Yeah, exactly.
When appropriate,
Yeah, I mean,
sounds
I
good.
wouldn't say we never do it, at the discretion of the planning board.
Well, here's the rub. The reason we're doing this in the subdivision regulations, which I know we're like deep in the weeds, but this is important because specifically related to the open space, everything that the town through our planning board, everything we've been able to secure as part of the development process has only been because the developer's been willing, right? None of it is required, and they could say no at any point. But through cooperation, we've been able to secure a lot. We're trying to change that dynamic so that they know up front what's required, and then the like negotiations of, hey, let's fine tune this to make it right, is a much narrower opportunity. Yeah, Andy?
So why wouldn't we make it a requirement to have a parking space with the opportunity to request a removal if there is interconnectivity elsewhere?
I think it's the balancing of the scales.
That's why I say it's a lot easier to say, okay, put in 1-2 parking spots, and then if you're like, but this connects to these other areas. Oh yeah, you're right. We probably don't need that there. Then you can take it out.
So I'll just
Then you're
say,
not fighting
yeah.
trying to get it. You already have it.
I hear that point. The trail interconnectivity stakeholder group, and this is people from the snowmobile club, from the trails committee, from the town lands committee, from the select board staff. This is a very multidisciplined group of people that spent a lot of time talking about parking areas. And I'll paraphrase, but the conclusion of that effort was we don't want a bunch of small parking areas all over town. Plain and simple. It's more to maintain. It creates opportunities for problems. Our energy is better focused elsewhere. And so I would encourage the planning board to defer to the work that they've done these were lengthy conversations where we came to that conclusion, and maybe create an opportunity so that maybe even if it isn't required, maybe at open space access points, that there's at least one open space access point that hasn't expanded right away, or some additional area that in 50 years, in 100 years, there's something there that can be done, but maybe not be required.
Provision for future parking.
Right.
And I guess my general sense is I probably wouldn't even have a rub on it if somebody could park along the side of the road and go in, but because we have a no parking on the side of the road ordinance, it makes it.
I think for us, Connor, the fact that the Winnie the Pooh parking is always full.
Mhm.
We provided additional access point from the Young Road development.
Mhm.
That clearly to me was a good thing to do. And to not have that option to do it.
I think you still have that option. I think the question is, do you want to require it every time or not?
I think I want to make it clear that it may be required.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure we both heard the same thing, so we're not arguing about it tomorrow. So 10.6 was really long. We can use the 2 examples Mark provided to craft a shorter example draft language for like the land piece, where the land goes. And then we can, by priority, we can start with the requirement for public access, then the trail component, then encouraging land transfer to the municipality, and then when deemed appropriate, space for future parking. So we can kind of lay that out and provide it to you as a draft so you can see it. Then you feel free to wordsmith from there.
The only other thing that, concern I have is, the Hollis piece you have here.
Yeah.
You know, we like to have, when the homeowner association is responsible for it in the future, we often require for, you know, the stormwater management stuff.
Yep.
Sometimes for the trails, we like that be clearly in there that it stays with the homeowners and it's in the deeds. Because, you know, what happens is,
They dropped the
maybe
ball.
the first guy knows,
Right.
then someone else buys it and it's not on the deed. He says, I didn't sign up for this. So we want to make sure it's not only defined that they have responsibility, but it's also in the,
Specifically the stormwater infrastructure, I heard you.
and if they have responsibility for the open space.
Yep.
Well, I think that's kind of how 10.6 got to be the length that it is what happened is we as a board were dealing with, and, you know, John and everyone who would come in and have some problem with open space and what wasn't being managed correctly or wasn't being handled right, or there was some other issue, or they're like, well, we expected the Conservation Commission to do this, and they're like, we don't do that, that's not us. So it evolved into what you see here, which is how do we make sure we have literally crossed every T and dotted every I of what will come up and haunt us as we go through it. And this is how we got here. I
Do
mean,
we
Jamie's
feel-
been part of this for 10+ years as well.
Do we feel like as we're entering a new era, new expectations, do we think that we can pare that down? I mean, I think maybe some language about future responsibilities of a homeowners association and list some examples seems appropriate. But do we still feel like we need all of the language?
I think it can get pared down, but I think it has to get pared down in a way that it references their homeowner's document with maybe a very abridged list of it. The homeowner's document, association document must also include these items, and it's just a.
But if you are going to require public use of that open space and then tell someone, if you buy in that subdivision, it's your responsibility to maintain it and keep it cleaned up and keep the trash all out, and they can't keep the public from going in, that's kind of like, really? I mean, how?
But I think that's your argument against the parking spaces, basically, is to keep the public out and just have. Well, I think if it's public, right?
Right.
It's no longer
I mean,
homeowners.
I think what I'm talking about is more like what Ron's talking about, where there is storm basins that need to be maintained and catch basins, and then storm management plans. Right.
Most of those have to do with the road infrastructure, and if the town takes it over, the town takes over that type of infrastructure too that goes with that roadway as part of their maintenance. Now, if the town never takes the road over, then the association owns the road and maintains it, then they would still have to continue maintaining it.
I don't know if the
Whit-
town does.
Whitner's Run.
So when-
Whitner's Run's a perfect example, right? There's stormwater infrastructure on Whitner's Run, Oak Hill Road subdivision. That's going to be a private road. The plan is that's a private road forever, right? And they will be responsible for maintaining that forever. The question is, do you need something in your conservation subdivision regulations that specify that? Or as you're discussing the drainage analysis and looking at the homeowner's documents, which you're doing anyways, is that process working like it worked with Whitner's Run? Or do you need to have other language here?
Well, if relative to maintenance of drainage, that should be outside of the cluster, because if they do a conventional, does that mean the town takes it over?
Good point.
If the town takes over, typically in the past, when the town takes over the road, the town takes over the infrastructure that goes with the road.
That's what I mean. I mean, the project out here is it's a town road.
Mhm.
And I assume the.
Well, it will be. It isn't right now.
Well, it will be.
Yeah, we know what we're talking about.
And I assume that when it gets taken over, all the detention ponds associated with it will now become the responsibility of the town to maintain, not the homeowners that live up there.
What Mark's saying is maybe it doesn't belong in conservation subdivisions at all. Maybe if we're worried about the language relative to the responsibility of the homeowners association, that belongs in regulations that apply to
Anything.
conservation. Yeah, anything.
Well, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say we have open space, it's not public. We don't take it
Private
over, it's not
open
town owned. Beaver rolls on, dams up the thing, the pond floods one guy's property.
Sure.
Is it his responsibility to fix it, or does the HOA?
Well, if it's a beaver, probably it's nobody's responsibility.
100%.
Yeah.
He's 100% right. We've dealt with
That's
this
probably a
with the
bad
state.
example.
It gets flooded from, we get a big rain event, I get flooded, my property gets flooded. My responsibility is the HOA.
It's an act of God. You wait for the rain to go down.
Raise your hand that are in the room.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's in the open space, the problem in the open space, it's not on my property, but it's impacting my property.
Maybe, yeah, so we're not gonna be able to solve all of the problems.
I think we have what we need to get a second draft.
Yeah.
That I feel confident. I'm not sure what's gonna happen to the poor beaver.
Well, I know what happened if it was near me.
So we can work on getting another draft and then send it off to staff to make sure that you guys look at it and we'll get it to the planning board. So does that make sense?
Was there?
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lively discussion, as usual.
Always
Great.
That's good.